So first up, we have details of our market survey on training provider expectations for the next 3 months. This is important work for GWO members. They're keen to know the market will be able to meet demand when they send technicians for training with external providers. We received 91 responses from training providers, representing 57% of the market by volume of training provided. First, I'll show you the result for the top 10 GWO training markets, and then we'll look at the rest of the world. So here's the top 10 markets. This is how much training they expect to complete in the months of May, June and July 2020 compared with the same period last year. In 2019, these markets were collectively responsible for 80% of all GWO training. To the left are expectations for May, then June and July. The darker column is our confidence level in the result, calculated as a proportion of the sample size. So with Belgium, for example, we have a high degree of confidence having received responses from all training providers in that country, and less so in Poland. Globally, GWO training fell to 24% of 2019 levels during the lockdown. With these reopening estimates, the average across the top 10 is 57% this month, increasing to 90% in June and 91% in July. As you can see, and you can probably understand, there's big differences from one country to another. Spain, for example, where most told us they won't reopen until the end of this month. However, there's an expectation that that market, which is top 5 market for GWO training, it will bounce back in June and July. Next door in Portugal, there seems to be a lot of confidence for the next few months, similarly in Germany. The Danes are a little bit more pessimistic. By July, they expect to be back at 3/4 of the volume of training completed in the same month last year. Sticking again with the top 10 markets, we can see when centres reopened on this slide. To understand exactly how many are reopened today, you need to combine columns 1, 3, 4 and 5. That gives us around 60% telling us they're now open for business. The biggest outlier, as I mentioned on the last slide, is in Spain, where 6 out of 10 told us they're not going to reopen until late this month or early June. The rest of that sample group told us they haven't actually decided yet, so it remains to be seen. Here we have the rest of Europe. Again, some differences in the level of confidence, but there are some encouraging signs in larger markets like Romania, which expects to be back to 100% in July. Italy and Sweden are 2 markets of roughly equal size for GWO training, and while one's remained open pretty much throughout the pandemic, Sweden that is, Italy has experienced, as we all know, one of the strictest lockdowns in Europe, if not the world. And it's quite interesting to see from their market expectations, they almost match equally for June and July. So perhaps that indicates, the wider influence of travel restrictions wherever you are, and the slowdown or potential slowdown in confidence in markets. And finally, the rest of the world, which includes some very large wind markets and growing regions for GWO training. Unfortunately, in this case, the 2 largest are India and China, which we have fairly low confidence levels in terms of the result of this survey. However, elsewhere it looks like training will bounce back in Australia, in Canada and Japan. Taiwan is also looking good. Those of you who joined us for our webinar a couple of weeks ago with National Kaohsiung University will know that they trained at 100% capacity all the way through the pandemic. Finally, South Africa, which is the only large market for GWO training in Africa and had been growing really quickly, we're seeing potential negative outlook there because the lockdown could endure for some time yet. So again, we're going to be updating this as time goes by. We keep in really regular contact with the network. So just to clarify, there's a lot of assumptions in this analysis, and the numbers can be influenced up and down, and these are estimates. Demand is probably the biggest unknown. From our members' point of view, I can say we've shared the details of this survey, and for some it's exactly the kind of information they're looking for. if I can underline that point, you know, training providers, customers, they need to know when and where they can send people to training. So please, you know, if you are a training provider and you want to give us that kind of information, then the next time we issue a survey of this nature, please help us out by completing it. The second limitation is that we can't really anticipate, can any of us, the path of the pandemic. So the reopening dates themselves may be overly optimistic. I've talked a lot about confidence levels in the survey, so I won't explain that any further. Finally, we've spoken to lots of training providers who've told us that they're extending their opening hours. Chris, you're actually Siemens Gamesa in Orlando is one of those. Just tell us a bit about what adjustments you've made to when and how you're opening.
Yes, that's correct. So we closed down our operations roughly around mid-March. So we tried to do as much as we could virtually for our new hire training, but we kind of had people stacking up. So we had enough of a backlog that we decided to shift to a 7-day work week. So I have no days off. The goal with that was to actually minimize the amount of time that my students are at the training center and also sitting in a hotel with nothing to do. So our decision was to try and maximize their training time, get them in, get them out, and then also get through that backlog as quickly as possible.
Okay. So on the other hand, the final point is even harder, more challenging to confirm, really. But we expect some training providers will actually decide against reopening, you know, where it's uneconomical to do so. So again, we'll try and provide some feedback on, you know, what kind of activity there's been in that regard.